Hello, everyone. My name's Ben McElroy.
Hey everybody, I'm Justin Woodcock.
And I'm William Fick.
And we're going to be discussing nuclear weapons in the 20th century. Justin is a financial planner. I work in the solar industry, and Will is an aspiring museum director.
Yes, I am.
Quick shout out to our video sponsor, New Horizon Solar Solutions, for all your solar needs. All right, guys, getting into the topic a little bit. We can kind of start wherever you want, but typically when I consider nuclear weapons, I like to kind of take a step back and think about what was going on before like nuclear weapons were being used. And so do you guys have any commentary on like the bombing of Japan, the bombing of Germany during World War II, anything like that?
We absolutely should have bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think Truman made the right call.
We're just jumping right into it.
I know, dude. He just went right into the sauce. He's like, not only do I think this was a great idea, we should have done it sooner. Will, do you want to expand on that?
Yes. So a lot of controversy around the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki kind of stem from the fact that we're thinking about those decisions in cold blood. We are not fighting an active war. We're not fighting a world war right now. So we can look back with the time and the patience that it requires to criticize these kind of decisions. But in 1945, you can't ignore the kind of political environment that Truman was operating in. Because if he spent all the time and money on the Manhattan Project developing an atomic bomb, a war-winning weapon, and didn't use it, that would have been the end of his presidency. And it would have been political suicide for the guy.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really interesting take, Will, and that's important to point out because a lot of people are just like, "Oh, it's horrible," It was there should have been another way, but I mean, if you think about how newspapers were printing headlines that already said, like Dewey beats Truman, if he had not used the bomb, then that truly would have been the reality. And I mean, if you think about the thousands of men and women we lost over the course of 1942 to 1945. Imagine if you are the family of a fallen soldier, a fallen Marine in the Pacific, and the president comes out and says, hey everyone, we've invested billions of dollars. We put quite literally some of the brightest minds on the planet to work on this. We had a war-winning weapon, and we invaded Japan, and your son died. I'm sorry. Here's your flag. Here's his pension. I mean, they'd be suing the federal government left and right. And not only that, Truman's political career would be over.
Well, and I think it's pertinent to remember that, Truman didn't know about the project until he was the president. And so it's really interesting to understand, FDR had just won his fourth presidential term and died shortly thereafter. And all of a sudden now the haberdasher from what state is he from?
Missouri.
Haberdasher from Missouri, and he's just like, a regular Joe Schmo dude that FDR chose as his VP because he would help the votes, is now handed the reins. And I think back to something that a famous podcaster said about the previous presidency. They're like, did he take him into the office and be like, all right, this is where the aliens are. This is what you need to know about Russia. This is actually what's going on with China. I'm just imagining some Joe Schmo from Missouri who was a relatively little league politician compared to the greatest president the U.S. had seen up until then. And then being like, hey, we have this $1 billion project that's going to kill 100,000 people every time you use it. It'd be a perspective shift, never before had anything like that even been theorized, you couldn't conceptualize that.
Yeah. And like you said, Truman was just the political equivalent of just a regular guy. I mean, this is a guy who broke down in tears saying that he wasn't man enough for the job, let alone to be the first president to figuratively push that button. And yes, it is terrible that we had to do that. It was terrible what we did to Hiroshima, and it was even worse that we had to do it again for Nagasaki. But if we chose not to nuke them and we had to invade Japan, it would have been even more terrible. And the war wouldn't have ended for years longer. I mean, all the men on the mainland islands of Japan, they weren't there. And the Japanese economy and the industry was in shambles at this point. And they were training the women and children in the streets with sharpened bamboo sticks to repel the American invaders that everybody knew were eventually going to come. And these were not going to be trained soldiers in an enemy uniform directed by officers to attack you. These were going to be people who almost are civilians. And that would have been a whole nother can of worms to open as to what we should do with these people. You know, if they're trying to kill you with a sharpened stick and you have a machine gun and tank divisions, like what kind of a battle would that be?
Yeah, it's not even, at that point, it boils down to, it's not even just, you know, a rebel force in a country that you're attempting to occupy and pacify. It's almost makes the jump to like state-sponsored insurgency. They were absolutely not going to surrender. So I think that's a great point as well, Will.
It's interesting to me to, you know, because again, our perspective as 21st century people looking back is so different. Again, we're in cold blood during a hot-blooded thing. Like looking back on America's stance on like, you know, Japan after Pearl Harbor, after like the Pacific Theater, and just the absolute like buzzsaw of human life, and just like people coming home with no limbs, no arms, no legs, missing eyes. Like, you know, it was such a heated and like emotional period. And now for us to look back and be like, well, like the ethics of whether or not they should have used this is such an interesting thing, because we weren't raising any eyebrows at us like bombing Germany. You know, like we leveled Germany, and hundreds of thousands of people died in these bombing attacks. And like, you know, you never hear about it because it's not as flashy as the Battle of Britain. It's not as flashy as like, you know, Midway, or, you know, all these different battles that like catch our attention because they're full of those heart-wrenching stories. Like in the daily grind of war at the world level, you know, every day thousands of people died. And it wasn't necessarily, go ahead.
No. Sorry. Please finish.
No, you're good. I was just going to say, like, it wasn't always like swinging battles like between the German and, you know, USSR forces where like millions of people were involved, but like daily skirmishes, you know, you pop out of a foxhole and get shot in the face. Like,
Definitely. Even just taking away like the daily battles or the large battles, you know, the titles that maybe the general populace knows a little bit more, like Midway, Battle of the Philippine Sea, you know, Battle of London, the Fall of Berlin, all that stuff. When you talk about the morality of dropping an atomic weapon on not an opposing military force, but on the civilian population of another country that you are at war with, which you're not just at war with, you are at total war with. Europe had been experiencing total war since 1939. China had been experiencing total war since 1937, based on the campaign that the Japanese were waging against them. Pretty much there were no holds barred, obviously. I mean, as everyone knows, World War I was a game changer in the sense that no one ever knew it could be that bad. And then World War II came over the top and did it again, and pretty much showed that when the stakes are that high, humanity is not afraid to say there are no rules. Civilians are targets. Children are targets. Hospitals are targets. I'm simply not saying that that's right, but I am saying that those options are not pulled from the table like they would be in a modern war, because we haven't seen that type of situation. So when you think about, you know, you drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki and 70 to 80,000 people die. A week beforehand, when we're firebombing Tokyo, 70 to 80,000 people die in that instance. You know, thousands more die after the fact from fires that consume entire city blocks. And, you know, there's not enough spots for people to be treated for their burns. So when you talk about the morality of an atomic weapon, obviously it's dangerous that one single thing can cause that kind of destruction, but we were causing that kind of unparalleled death and destruction before we even dropped the bombs.
100%. Yeah, it's such an interesting thing for us to say like these atomic weapons, because what was used in Japan and what is currently at the disposal of several nations is not even equivocal. Like I was just looking up the yield of blast power of, you know, the bombs that we dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They're like 60, you know, kilotons. Like it's just like a large amount of TNT, if I have that correctly.
Very large amount of TNT.
Right. Actually, I
large.
was wrong. It's 15 kilotons of TNT, which again is no joke. But now in the current era, the weapons that we use bombs like that to detonate the actual bomb. And so that's like the fuse for a bomb that we would use in today's standards, you know. So it's definitely a thing that is scaled, and it's not linear. It's exponentially more powerful. And so if we're terrified and like we've seen the destructive force of something that now is like child's play, it really begs the question of like, you know, what does the future look like? And we'll circle back to that because I think that's the ending of the podcast. But I mean, it's a different world now for sure.
It is. And when you compare atomic weapons that are measured in kilotons, and then you take nuclear weapons that are measured in megatons, like those are completely different classes of weapons. And Ben, you made a good point where nuclear weapons require an atomic detonation to set them off. And again, you are correct. It's an exponential increase, and there is no upper limit to their power. The largest, I think it was 50 megatons. It was Tsar Bomba detonated by Khrushchev in the 50s. It was like bringing a literal piece of the sun down to Earth. And it raised some questions from Soviet commanders, which was a new thing in the 50s, because if you question Soviet leadership under the Stalin era, that was something that could be bad for your health. But under the thaw, you know, when you're trading cities for cities with a little bomb, like Fat Man and Little Boy, and then you take something that is the equivalent of making a natural disaster, like at what point do we surpass accomplishing military objectives? And Justin, you said something earlier about like targeting hospitals and targeting civilians, how it's not right. And yeah, I agree. It's not right, but it's not wrong either. It's just war.
Yeah. Will, I want to backtrack slightly to how you say, you know, at what point is the use of nuclear weapons almost not achieving military goals? It's obviously, I mean, I'm sure, as you know, Ben, I'm not sure if you've heard, but I mean, there were declassified plans that came out after the breakup of the Soviet Union, whether it was in the 90s or the early 2000s. I believe it was the Poles who, in an effort to, kind of bring themselves out of the Soviet era, declassified these plans, and the Soviets had drawn up invasion plans of Western Europe where the entire basis was to nuke major cities and capitals in order to reach, Western Europe at a breakneck pace. I believe it's the Rhine River that they're pushing for. You know, they're hoping to be there in under 2 weeks. And quite literally, I mean, the plan includes, nuking Eastern European capitals that might be under Allied control, cities in Germany, cities in France, simply to make it all the way to the Atlantic and almost,
No
attain
resistance.
blitzkrieg, atomic blitzkrieg, if you will.
Attack Germany with their own tactics. No, it's very interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up, Justin. One of the things I wanted to touch on is after World War II ended, the world was in a shaky position where World War III could have happened immediately. At that point, once Japan was defeated, all of the Axis powers were defeated soundly and handily. And it was one of these situations where as soon as Japan surrendered, the two biggest players in the world, the US and the USSR, could look at each other across the table and say, okay, like, we are now the biggest threats to one another. We are now natural enemies. Conflict is almost unavoidable, especially when their ideologies as far as like society, as economics differ so vastly. It's almost a miracle that it didn't happen. But there was a great concern that the Red Army would just sweep across Europe. And, especially by like 1947, when we'd pulled out, essentially, the only thing really deterring the USSR from doing so was the threat of nuclear weapons, because we had no military presence that would be able to withstand that.
Ben makes a good point. We were devoting such a huge chunk to our economy to sustain our military at the end of World War II. And World War II was going on like 6 years, and America was involved 42 to 45. We were redlining our economy, and we just couldn't keep up that sort of spending. So the government did make the right financial call to demobilize and send everybody home. But then you only have a handful of divisions in Western Europe, and you have the entire Red Army, which at this point was the most superior fighting force in the history of war, sitting there just on the other side. And this was an army that was designed to slug it out with the German military. I mean, if you look at the Battle of Kursk, what that was like, that was a battle of apocalyptic standards before we had apocalyptic weapons to shoot each other with. And then the weapons would be the only deterrent to keep them from just pushing all the way to the Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. It's a terrifying thought, especially when we start to like really conceptualize that people that are still alive today were around when, like, you know, the threat of, hey, like at any point the next great war could pop off. And you know, that's not to say that it couldn't happen now. You know, how long ago were we seeing Afghanistan almost started World War III? You know, those memes mocking political events. But, you know, like, it's not as far away as people think. And the reality that, like, hey, these events happened one lifetime ago. Like, humanity has not evolved drastically in any way within the last 80 years. You know, technologically, society's advanced, but the core principles that make up humanity and that like allowed for the atrocities and the battles that we saw, like those still exist in us today. And we like to pretend that it's not a factor. And so that's always fascinated me.
I don't mean to make a very antiquated history reference, but I feel like it's so fitting. You know, Ben, when I love how Dan Carlin says that a 17th or 18th century, you know, envoy from the Ottoman Empire or Western Europe could have easily seen that America and Russia were simply destined to be enemies at this point because they were the greatest threat to each other's powers. And what I had mentioned earlier was it reminds me of when the king of Ephyria, I believe, you know, where the term Pyrrhic victory comes from, is leaving Rome after almost like a successful run. Obviously, Germany in this case is not successful, but they kind of have front row seats to what's going on between the Americans and the Soviets. And, you know, the king of Ephyria is saying, what a battlefield we are leaving behind for the Carthaginians in this case, you know. Yeah, the Carthaginians and the Romans, you know, he could see what was destined to come. And it's almost like the other players, the people stuck in the middle could see that these two superpowers were simply bound to clash.
Yeah, it's almost inevitable. And so the fact that like we never came, at least publicly or like professedly, to blows, you know, one-on-one is almost unheard of in you know, in a historical sense. Like, you know, Carthage and Rome did go to war. The North and the South did go to war. You know, like that conflict did happen. And, you know, we're very lucky that was not the case in the 20th century.
Well, we're not out of the flames yet. You know, the question as to whether or not we can handle our weapons technology is only answered when we find out we can't.
Correct. Definitely. Absolutely.
I'm going to pan down.
Right.
Have you guys ever heard of Thucydides Trap?
I don't believe so, no.
What we're talking about actually has a name, this whole idea of great powers destined for war. It's called Thucydides Trap. I don't know who, well, there's actually Thucydides who coined it, who was an ancient Greek historian on par with Herodotus. And according to his model, if you have a number one power that is threatened to be surpassed in influence by an up-and-coming second power, they will fight a war. And that war, according to historical trends, will be the most disastrous and bloody war at that point in the history of humanity. The two most recent examples would be both world wars. And before that, the first traceable example would be when Spain was eclipsed by the brand new British Empire. They fought wars that set standards for how awful things could be. And with that in mind, what is the next Thucydides trap that you guys think we might have to face?
Justin, you want to tackle that one first?
I would say immediately I think of China overtaking the U.S. I see nods. I'm
Yep.
sure that's what you guys had in your head. I mean, it's just obvious. Russia is a shell of what it formerly was. It's simply not a world player in the ways and means that it thinks it is. Its economy is not what it was. Obviously, without satellite states, I mean, it simply can't compete with the likes of Russia and China. And as China continues to grow and grow, I mean, I'm sure you both have seen the recent headline about them testing a hypersonic weapon in August. And we didn't even realize that was going on. So it's very clear and very obvious that they have capabilities that, if we know of, certainly people like us are not aware of, because that information is not being disseminated, or maybe we don't even know it all. Their economy continues to grow, although right now, it is stagnating slightly, but their military power continues to grow. They're looking to expand their influence into the first island chain, eventually hoping to hit the second island chain. With Taiwan thrown into the mix, them looking to exert their pressure there, in their own backyard. Do I even need to say it's obvious that they're the clear competitor for the U.S. right now, whether people want to admit it or not, or whether it's for the right reasons or the wrong ones. It's simply just the nature of power.
Obviously China is the most obvious answer. I really want to come back to that because I want to have a little wargaming scenario with y'all. But two other answers popped into my mind, and so I would throw out India as a potential rival. And when you were describing Russia, you were talking about how it's not what it once was. You're absolutely right. Like it's not the world player that it used to be, but it's what you described it as a regional power. Like in Northern Asia, much Eastern Europe, that's a regional power. Like Russia is significant. India, just by its size alone and its importance to the global economy, is in a position where I believe within 1 century, or maybe a little bit more, could be in a position similar to China is now, where it's threatening the world equilibrium. And the best comparison is Persia before Darius the Great. Like Persia was kind of considered like the backwater slum of that portion of the world, and then within Darius the Great's lifetime goes from being king of Persia to king of the universe. Like it has the potential for massive growth. And I think that's mainly due to manpower and natural resources that it has access to. So those are my two answers.
I definitely want to say something about that, but before, Will, do you have anything you want to add in there?
Yes. I agree that India has the potential to be the power that you think it could be, but I don't think it's going to be as threatening as China. China has the population of India, and it also has the infrastructure to support that population. India has the population and not the infrastructure, and that's going to lead to a collapse internally of some sort or another. So I think they'll have a little bit longer to go, and they're probably going to have to work through some major problems before they become a threat to anybody's power over the Pacific.
Okay, but hear me out. India sneak attacks China.
They would have to go over the Himalayas.
Right. There would have to be some ambitious moves being played there. Yeah, I'm kind of with Will there. I would definitely agree that, and I wouldn't even necessarily say India would be threatening anything. I would just say they would be more so kind of asserting themselves on the global stage, taking up a wider spot. But right now, economically speaking, they're absolutely strangled by China's Belt and Road Initiative. China has made it one of the main points of that initiative to completely circumnavigate India.
Sure.
They run all of their trade, all of their railways, their shipping lanes bypass India. It all heads straight to the Middle East, to Eastern Europe, to Africa. So India definitely has some catching up to do there if they want to even start to rival China in a trade sense or a connectivity sense.
Sure. Yeah, no, again, just it was the only other it was the only other power that I could see making significant leaps and bounds in a century.
Ben, you said you had two examples,
Yeah.
and India was one of them.
So China being the other. And then the only reason that this came to mind is just to see from a societal standpoint, like, have you guys looked at, and this is actually more so in India, but like if you look at like Abu Dhabi in the 1970s to today, like, you know, even if you start in 1970 to 71, 50 years, the difference that society was able to do in that 50 years was all brought about by the discovery of a natural resource. You know, all of the money in Saudi Arabia allowed Abu Dhabi to go into, you know, blossom into like one of the hubs of humanity. And I think that if something like that were to occur, society could catapult itself. And I think India might, you know, if I don't know, uranium is discovered in the Himalayan mountains, and India is like, you know, they, you know, that could be a catalyst for societal growth. But that India was my other, China and India were my two.
If oil to the 20th century brought about everything that we know already happened, what's going to be the next new resource that happens to us in our lifetimes that catapults us forward again?
Justin, you got any hypotheses?
There are so many things that there are so many directions that we could take this right now, but I would say if we're focusing on one resource, it would, yeah. Will?
Oh, I was pointing at
if there was one resource that I think, are you saying one resource that would drive like our next technological advancement, or one resource that is going to be the source of conflict?
The next resource that is going to be the engine for the next great leap forward in technological advancement, not just for the United States, but for the world as a whole.
So
like what oil did to, you know, the combustion engines.
Technologically speaking,
yeah,
I'm gonna throw two. I'm gonna throw to stay in the vein of the nuclear weapon conversation. I'm gonna throw one that I feel like is the most likely flashpoint for an international conflict, and then I'm going to throw one your way that I feel like is going to drive us forward. So in terms of driving us forward, I can't say specifically. I would say maybe something along the lines of cobalt, or you know, something that's absolutely critical in making computer chips, you know, electronic chips, advanced electronics, that sort of thing. Those things that are mined, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Central Africa, places like that, you know, as renewable energy becomes more and more ingrained in our society, I think that is going to be super important. And in terms of a resource, I think that could cause an international conflict, I would say water, specifically speaking, between Pakistan and India, being that, you know, 80% or 85% of India's water comes from the glacier in Pakistan's borders, or hopefully I don't have that flipped around. But I mean, they're both nuclear powers. And if push comes to shove, and, you know, 90% of your civilian populace can't have access to fresh water because your neighbor decides to cut it off, I think that could escalate extremely fast.
Do you think they'd nuke each other over water and potentially destroy the reason that they're nuking each other in the first place?
I don't think that they would nuke each other over water. Who am I to rule out the fact that those weapons might come into play if, you know, two highly populated countries like that actually engage in a major war? Because I don't foresee, you know, a war like that over something as critical as drinking water to be fought on a small scale.
That's a very interesting take. I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think that the importance of water is criminally underrated by those of us blessed enough to never have to struggle to find it. Water is one of the foundational aspects of life. And, you know, without it, it doesn't matter if you have nuclear weapons. If the guy that's going to push the button doesn't have water for, let's just say, a week, he's going to die. And, you know, you can supplement that with other beverages and stuff, but the water is such a thing that like we don't understand what it's like to not have water unless you live in California. But even then, like first world problems. Oh no, I can't take a bath. Like, like I don't know. That's just it's just an interesting thing. Fun fact: during the firebombing of Japan, kind of segue back, the lakes and rivers in Japan boiled from how hot the air and the fires of all the buildings were. That like people would run into the water thinking it would be safe, and they would literally get cooked alive because the water temperature just rose. Absolutely insane.
That sounds horrendous.
Yeah.
Will, I want to pose the same question to you. I know I took us a little bit off track, but if you could think of one resource that is going to drive us forward, that is going to become a point of conflict, whether that may lead to international conflict, nuclear conflict, what have you, what would you think that is?
I would have to give you the same answer that you gave me. I think water would be one of them, and then some sort of fundamental element that goes into making computer chips. I mean, we have a chip shortage right now. I know almost nothing about it except for the fact that there is one, and that it's making it difficult to buy things like cars and all that. And I would assume that it's not the actual, we don't mine these chips out of the mountain. We have to take like rare earth metals and then manufacture them through a process. And if it's not if it's not the shipping lines that are collapsing that are causing the shortage, it would be the fact that we are running like that the demand isn't meeting the supply. So whatever that may be, whether it be cobalt or copper, I think it would be a rare earth metal. I'll put it that way.
Definitely. To tie to, I mean, just a brief connection there is, I think with, about 85% of all electronic chips produced in the world being produced in Taiwan by Taiwan, that adds another level of complexity to the potential reunification of China and Taiwan. Will the U.S. get involved? Because with chip shortages already hitting us, with supply chain issues already being super prevalent, what would that look like with Chinese control of Taiwan? Would they put a stranglehold on that? Would that ease some of these supply chain problems? I don't know.
So I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently. Excuse me. And what I think will be the biggest catalyst for humanity's next expansion, I think it's going to come down to manpower. Like obviously automation is growing and there's things that can be automated, but I think right now, especially given like the response to COVID and to working that we're currently experiencing, I think a country that's able to proactively deploy its manpower in a way similar to what China is doing with like massive mobilization of their workforces and like massive infrastructure and stuff, like, it's not necessarily the super sexy jobs of being like an accountant or a banker or anything like that, but to be reminded what human beings are capable of building when a lot of them get together and work collectively towards a task. You get to like see some pretty incredible stuff. And right now that's a very difficult thing to do in first world Western countries. And I feel like China and other places in the world that perhaps don't necessarily share our democratic values have a leg up as far as like being able to get their population to do things. And I think if we keep down this road, the U.S. will be well behind. We're already hurting in our military numbers. We're already hurting in, just the physical capabilities of our population. Now we don't even want to like do our jobs. Like it's just a weird thing.
It is. And it is a threat to our national security. And your comment on the fact that our military is suffering, I would disagree with that. We do not have a huge ground army. We just don't. Our military power comes from our Navy and our Air Force. Like I know I've asked this to Ben before because I think it's such a fascinating statistic. But Justin, do you know who has the largest Air Force in the world?
Number one is the American Air Force, and number two is the U.S. Army.
U.S. Navy, actually.
U.S. Navy.
But yes, you get the point. You get the point. Like the two top spots are occupied by two different branches of the American military. And then our Navy also eclipses that of China. I think we have something along the lines of like 12 nuclear powered aircraft carriers and 50 something nuclear submarines, and China has far less than that.
China has one operational aircraft carrier, if I'm mistaken, no more than two, with 2 to 3 more scheduled to be built by the end of the 2030s. But that's so important, Will. I absolutely have to agree with you there. Ben, I don't necessarily think you're wrong in saying that the military could use some useful reforms. But if you look at the Air Force, like Will already stated, I mean, it's not even close. And if you look at navies, the PLAN outnumbers the People's Liberation Army Navy. It's China's Navy. Sorry, they outnumber the U.S. in terms of ships, but that's not an important metric to go by. If you look at tonnage, which really describes, the armor class of a ship, how big it is, how many men it can carry, the armament, the U.S. blows out the next 2 to 3 navies combined. The ships are simply built to last. They're built to fight. They're not patrol boats. We might not have as many warships, but one U.S. destroyer, one U.S. corvette might be worth 7 to 8 Chinese patrol boats.
No, so it's very pertinent that you bring that up, and this is actually the perfect segue. Before we started down this road, we were talking about like the potential big new players on the stage. One of the things that I was saying is I wanted to war game with you guys briefly about what would happen in a war between China and the U.S., assuming nuclear weapons weren't on the table. You guys are absolutely right. The U.S. Air Force and Navy are, they're the biggest players on the field by a significant margin, and there's no doubt to that. The issue that we then run into is if a war between China and the U.S. breaks out, we are not in a position to adequately respond if China decides to invade elsewhere. And again, that's not to say.
Yeah, define elsewhere.
So if China decides to annex Taiwan, or if they decide that, hey, this very desirable portion of Mongolia or this portion of Russia with all of their natural resources looks really good, we can absolutely respond with an air-based attack, and but we have no way of maintaining physical ground control if a war like that broke out. And obviously, it would be partially responsible for the country if they did invade anywhere else. But China's not been shown to be shy about having leisurely grasps on borders of nations.
So what would that look like?
Well, and so my big question is, and it kind of harkens back to the nuclear question, is a ground force relevant in the nuclear era? And I think Vietnam, the Korean War really showed us that even though nuclear weapons exist, it doesn't mean that we get to neglect having boots on the ground, because the fight is not always in momentous days and like bombings and naval battles. It's in the daily grind of sinking ships, fighting the fight that's not sexy. I think the
military is the military relevant in the age of nuclear weapons? I think it absolutely is.
Absolutely,
I think it is too.
If you have no military but a stockpile of nuclear weapons, you could be conquered by just having enemy soldiers just walk through your country with no opposition whatsoever, because
100%.
You won't nuke your own home. You won't nuke your own home soil unless it's a dire situation and the end is nigh.
Well, and so, but again, I feel like that plays into if China was to aggressively militarily invade any of its neighbors. Again, we have the Air Force capabilities to deter this, but then we're not bombing China. We're bombing our allies or acquaintances' nation.
Taiwan.
Well, if you want to use that example, but again, it's not China's buildings that are getting bombed, even though Chinese soldiers might be, in there. It's an interesting thing that we never really had to run into during World War II, where you were guilty by proximity. If you were if you were living in Germany during World War II, it's kind of one of those things sorry, we're trying to hit your guys' military assets, but if the military is where you are, And it, it just seems like an interesting thing that not a lot of people conceptualize. So I was thinking it.
I think it's interesting because there are so many different factors that play into that. Obviously, a Taiwan scenario is an entirely different animal, and really, there's two main outcomes there, two routes the U.S. can take, I guess. But before we even go into that, I mean, you have to assess that the U.S. armed forces are designed, or have been redesigned, I should say, from the Cold War era on as, for lack of a better term, a global police force. I mean, that we are the only country capability to project power the way that we can. I mean, who else has military bases in hundreds of countries? You know, our Air Force is massive. Our Navy is massive. China simply doesn't even have the capability, neither does Russia, neither does Japan, Indonesia. No one does to just stroll some warships, through the Panama Canal or off the coast of California, whereas that's the norm for the U.S. We're posted up in the South China Sea. We're posted up in the Sea of Japan, off the coast of North Korea. We're in their backyard. So the way the Chinese military has developed is very much so they are meant to play in their own sandbox, if that makes sense. I mean, they have dramatically increased their stockpile of missiles that can reach the first island chain, being Taiwan, islands that are close to the Chinese mainland in the Indian subcontinent. The second island chain, they've upped their missiles there, things that could hit the Philippines, maybe Guam, things like that. So it's not like China could really go anywhere or do anything outside of picking on its neighbors. But it's also not like the U.S. has the strength or the capability to invade mainland China, at least not right now.
Right.
It never will.
Right. Exactly. Which is why in the case of Taiwan, you have two options. China decides to invade, and, there are only 15 viable beaches, give or take, for an effective naval landing of Taiwan, So do we get involved directly and fire on Chinese ships, or is the play to simply let the Taiwanese fight their own battles and almost become this sort of international pariah? Like, if there's no reason that we should fight them there, because it may affect our own national security if our armed forces are critically damaged or endangered in a conflict over there, do we simply let Taiwan take the fall and then China is ostracized from the global community? I mean, the UN, all of our allies, even some of China's allies, they wouldn't let that fly. So it's just a matter of direct versus indirect intervention.
Well, I feel it's important to point out that we're talking about this in the wake of the Afghanistan pullout.
Absolutely.
And the effect that has had on the U.S. allies. So let's assume that China it just straight up invades Taiwan. Taiwan no longer exists, and it's forcefully reunited with China. We can't win a land war in Asia. The Western armies just are not designed to fight that way. So, but then the question is, if we were to amphibiously land in Taiwan, is that as far as it would go? Because then it would still be, how do I put this? We invade in Taiwan to push the Chinese out, and then it's us in Taiwan, and then we're right back to where we started. And then if we just let the fate of Taiwan be decided by China, how is that going to look to U.S. allies when that's two other U.S. allies that we just kind of let go? First one was Afghanistan, and now it's Taiwan. Everybody's going to start wondering who's next, and they're going to start looking for themselves, and It might lead to a breakdown in the international community.
Definitely.
Food for thought, for sure. No, I mean, it's a fascinating discussion, but it's also a very, pertinent discuss. It's not something that we're actively thinking about. Like, what would it look like if, hey, war with a nation breaks out? Hey, the draft's back. We haven't done the draft since Vietnam. I'm signed up.
So am I.
You have to be.
Should women be signed up for the draft?
We're not going to go there today.
Okay.
We're not ready for that.
This is about nuclear weapons, Will.
All right. I'm getting ahead of myself.
There you go.
I don't necessarily know that we would utilize nuclear weapons in the case that Taiwan was invaded. I would argue that China would not nuke Taiwan simply because the whole point is to reunify the country under the one China system and the one China policy. And the strategic importance of the electronic factories and the general populace itself, I think nuking them would defeat the entire purpose of the invasion.
I would agree with you. So if we assume that we're not going to nuke them, and then China does get aggressive with Taiwan, how do you think we should react? If you were benevolent dictator of the United States.
Benevolent, that's a great touch.
Benevolent dictator of the United States, and Taiwan is invaded by Chinese ground forces, what would you do?
That is almost an impossible question to answer. If I, off the top of my head, have to come up with the most reasonable plan of attack, we would know far in advance that a Taiwanese invasion was coming, or an invasion of Taiwan was coming. China simply does not have the capabilities right now. If they were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, the amount of civilian ships that they would have to retrofit and enlist would be astronomical. They simply can't move their troops across the strait the way that they want to right now, the way that they safely and effectively can, to keep them safe from Taiwanese submarines, mines, beach defenses, which is why they say the country could not be invaded until at least 2027, at least from estimates. So knowing that it was coming, I think we would have to respond in tandem. We would have to stand by our allies, as ugly as that sounds. And, I don't necessarily have the stomach to see an international conflict between the US and China, but at a certain point, it's kind of just about what you need to do, not what about is right or wrong. And who are the Chinese to take away self-determination from the Taiwanese people? And who are we to allow their self-determination be taken away from them? So I think even if it was just on a naval scale, we would have to respond. We would at least have to try to defend the beachheads. I don't know if we would go as far as landing troops, but absolutely, I think we would need to do something. The only problem is, being that it's China's backyard, their missile capabilities, if we were outnumbered in terms of ships and forces were being swarmed, I just foresee a nightmare scenario where the U.S.'s national security is put at risk. I said earlier, we can't be touched right now simply because it's not possible. China doesn't have the capability to invade, and our capability to defend is way too high. But if we defend Taiwan and critically mess up, for lack of a better term, our armed forces, there might not be much we can do to stop them.
So, that's an interesting thought, and one that, again, not a common field of exploration of thought, but the U.S. has not been significantly harmed in a conflict since the Civil War. Maybe the Cuban-America War, the Spanish-American War.
Not even during the Spanish-American War.
Right. And so it's one of these things where, America's, for lack of a better term, played on everyone else's battleground and come out on top. And it's a situation where, even if we are in such a position of authority and power, it'd be something like the Doolittle raids on Japan during World War II. Could China sneak in, a sub off the coast of, California, off the coast of the East Coast, and launch missiles on American cities? Even if the damage they do is relatively insignificant from a symbolic standpoint, that illusion of safety, just, distance doesn't equal safety in the 21st century. Stealth bombers, you got there's all this crazy shit now that we just don't even think about. It's one of those things where I don't think we're as secure as we think we are.
Will, I don't know if you're thinking the same thing I am. I know you're on mute. I hope you can hear me. Ben, your assertion that distance does not equal safety in the 21st century, I think that's a really great point, and it's really important for people to think about, because that wasn't even the case in the 20th century, especially if you look at Japan, if you look at Germany, if you look at Russia. Your distance to your enemy there, in the case of the U.S. war in the Pacific, Japanese distance from the American homeland, that played zero to little role whatsoever. All it did was delay the inevitable. And if you look at the Doolittle raid, we were bombing the Japanese islands, almost as a direct response to Pearl Harbor. But it's not like that sort of thing did not happen to the U.S. Obviously, no foreign power has successfully invaded the U.S. since the War of 1812. Obviously, what I want to point out here, I say successfully, the Japanese did take a couple of the Aleutian Islands after Pearl Harbor. They held a couple of these islands starting in 1942 into 1943. I mean, obviously, they were basically worthless. There was nothing to them. But the fact of the matter is they did take a piece of the American homeland.
Right.
In addition to that, there were 2 instances where Japanese submarines appeared off the coast of California and actually shelled mainland institutions. One being an oil field was shelled in California. It was only a couple rounds, but I mean, the workers didn't even realize what was going on. They thought that maybe there had been an explosion with one of the pumps. And additionally, up in Washington, I believe, at the mouth of one of the main rivers up there, a Japanese submarine had breached the water and had fired on one of our coastal defenses. Obviously, there were no casualties, but what that does is spread mass hysteria amongst not only the western half of our population, but the eastern half, I mean, the entire country. When you don't feel untouchable anymore, not only are you scared, but you become a lot more desperate. You're a lot more willing to do things that you were not even thinking about when you didn't even know you could be touched.
That's very true.
I don't know if you have anything to add there, Will, or how much you got of that, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, based on what I heard, America hasn't really been touched by a war aside from what we did to ourselves. And that there were a couple of submarines that showed up on our coast and fired a few shells. But no foreign army has ever invaded the United States. And that's given us that sort of untouchable mentality that absolutely plays into the American mindset. And because of that mentality, when we do fall victim to a couple of shells falling up from the sky, it changes everything. I mean, look at what 9/11 did. 9/11 changed everything for everybody. And only now are we starting to see people come of age who don't remember it. And in 10 years, we're going to 10, 20, 30 years, how much of our voter base is never going to have seen 9/11 or heard of it or not watched it live on TV? And so I think with that being the only major infringement on the American Untouchable identity, I think we're going to start seeing some big changes here pretty soon, minus, a big war breaking out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know. It's such an interesting thing. Again, it's always been interesting to me to see how quickly humans forget, and also just how quickly we're no longer willing to educate about certain things. Like, I know 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds that have never heard of 9/11, that don't know what the Holocaust is. Like, it blows my mind. What are we teaching
them instead? Critical race theory?
We're not going to go there this episode. Gender studies. Like I said, but as someone whose family members died in the Holocaust, obviously that's more close to me than to someone who didn't, right? But the fact that the history books just gloss over the Holocaust, or what Stalin did to his own people, or what Mao did in China, close to as many people that died during World War II died in China under Mao's rule. That's a
great leap forward.
I was just about to say, not even his rule. If you just look at the Great Leap Forward itself, you can practically get those numbers from there. So then moving forward, it just continues to escalate.
And then with Stalin, it's the 5-year plan and the Great Terror.
I mean, with Stalin, you jump into the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so again, as 3 guys who love history and read about this stuff, we know about that. But again, 20th century history is not my wheelhouse. There's things that you guys are talking about that I've never heard of. And if I haven't heard of it, you can bet the kids that aren't history majors, that didn't study history in college, that didn't read their, history textbook front to back every year in school, they wouldn't know. it's scary because we're so easy to like forget that, 50 million people like you and I died in the span of a couple of years by their own country's hand. Like it's just such an interesting thing to conceptualize.
I think the most important thing to note about atrocities is that they don't necessarily pick a side. They're not perpetrated by a certain type of person or by a certain type of people. A lot of times in 20th century context, we talk about World War II, World War I, Africa. We talk about Pol Pot and Cambodia, things like that. But it's just important to note that tragedies and atrocities across history, whether they occurred for the right reasons there are no right reasons. Let me rephrase that. Regardless of the circumstances that they occurred under, it's important to know that the goal is to not repeat those. Whether that is a famine in Ukraine where millions of civilians die, whether that is slavery in America or segregation, or whether that's Bosnian and Serbian violence in the 90s in the Balkans. Genocide does not pick a side, and it's important to note that we have to avoid that at all costs, which is part of the reason why we need to not engage in a nuclear holocaust, because there are no winners.
Absolutely.
Mutually assured destruction.
Correct.
Good old MAD. Justin, one of the things you said that really caught my ear, I live on the 5th story of a building, and there's someone above me, so somebody's trampling around on the roof.
If we're apologizing for sounds, I'm sorry for my dog if you've heard it.
Sorry, we'll give you a pass. It's all right. The U.S. will give you a pass. That was an epic rap battle of history line for those of you that know. But anyway, no. What I wanted to say is, like, genocide is such an interesting topic, and almost no country alive today has not been the victim or the perpetrator of a genocide. And obviously you can point to like, well, I don't know about this small country, but like the reason I say that is it's ongoing. There's no end to the genocide era. Like, it's happening now, and people are just so quick to forget that. Like, you were talking earlier about like, well, how do we respond economically to China if they did this? Well, like, what about like the Weimar Muslims in China right now? Why is the world stage just letting it happen? Comparisons could be made to the Holocaust. Like, why did that just like, was it allowed to happen? And why did no one like, publicly denounce before it was too late, if that makes sense? And so I think what's missing in today's world is the proper education of how this happens and why it happens, but also the instillment in our youth that it's okay to say no to that. I feel like we grow up in such like a sheltered and such a washed version of history that we are unaware or unwilling to believe that it's happening now. And I don't know, it's always bugged me.
Do you think something like this is ever going to stop? Will we advance enough as a species to say that genocide is a thing of the past?
Here's the thing. Genocide is a very tricky concept to debate, because you have to get your definition of genocide squared away. Because
what's your definition of genocide?
Taking me back to history 300, baby. For me, man, I wrote so many papers on this. It's a long definition. I'm gonna go with the here we go. I'm gonna read to you the.
We're pulling up Merriam-Webster.
Not Merriam-Webster. The United Nations definition of genocide.
That's even better.
There we go.
I would say that's probably our best bet.
Yes. So. Okay. All right. So the term genocide was coined by Polish lawyer Ralph Lemkin in 1944 in his book Axis Rule. It consists developed the term partly in response to the Nazi policies of systematic murder of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, but also in response to previous instances in history of targeted actions aimed at destruction of particular groups of people. Later on, Ralph Lemkin led the campaign to have genocide recognized and codified as an international crime. And so there's a bunch of definitions, but basically it's the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And you can do that physically. You can do that in a couple different ways, but that's what I like to go.
Genocide is on purpose.
Genocide's on purpose, and it's the effort to destroy a people based on nation, race, ethnicity, or religion. And the catch-22 of that is it has to be done in totality, like to an effective level where that population is permanently decimated. And so,
that's the end goal, you're saying.
Right. But even if they don't fully succeed, like for it to be a genocide, it has to be done at such a level that it had the threat to do so. And so if you debate what constitutes a genocide, like I always think like what Rome did to Carthage, I consider that a genocide. Genocidal scholars say that's on the line because at the time Rome was capable of a genocide, but that's like the best example. But afterwards, after Rome, like it's not until the 1900s that you really see it at full scale.
I would argue that we saw it in the 1800s.
The Civil War or what?
With slavery. I mean, it wasn't maybe not like let's round up everyone and kill them all, but there was definitely an attempt to make mass sterilizations, mass just apathy towards the slave population, Black Americans. And that's where I would argue that a lot of times we think about genocide as like the Holocaust, where we're just rounding up tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and we're just killing them all in, a 4-year span, a 5-year span. That is as much a genocide in my eyes, in the term I'm saying, as, systematically trying to eliminate a people or enslaving them and simply forgetting about them over hundreds of years, or as small scale as if you look at what happened in the Balkans with Serbs, killing Muslims in that area in the 90s. I was just reading today, actually, that the Dutch government, there was a small detachment of Dutch peacekeepers in Bosnia, I want to say, and they were completely surrounded by an overwhelming Serb force, and the peacekeepers basically had no choice, or so they felt, but to assist these rebels in rounding up the local Muslims. And that was what they point to now as the first instance of genocide in that conflict. And the Netherlands actually had to come out and apologize for the role that they played in that, because they practically helped that get off the ground there. So I think regardless of if it's small scale, large scale, short term, or long term, if the end goal is the same, then the definition is the same for me.
Right.
So by that definition, would the Holodomor be a genocide?
That is interesting, and arguably, I would say yes.
I would say no.
What? Okay. So I'm on the fence. I know that I kind of walked myself into this one.
For those that don't know, can you explain the situation?
Well, you can explain.
The Holodomor, it was a side effect of Stalin's 5-year plan and industrialization and dekulakization. As he moved the USSR towards industrialization, it took people away from farming and agriculture, and as a result, it led to a famine.
Basically,
millions of people died in the 30s.
Yeah, 3 to 4 million.
It was planned.
There was intent. He actively shipped the remaining agriculture out of Ukraine to the rest of Russia in order to feed, Moscow and the other surrounding cities.
Right. I'm not necessarily saying that like it was planned well, but like to my understanding, like, people came to Stalin and they're like, hey, like these people are going to die, and he was like,
that's kind of where I agree with Will. Is it's not like Stalin said like, hey, let's starve the Ukrainians and just kill them. It was more so of like an apathetic view where they were like, hey, the civilians in, this area in the Ukraine are starving. And he pretty much was like, okay, well, keep exporting the grain, that sort of thing. So it was not directly because of their race, ethnicity, religion, or anything like that. It was simply because he didn't care. I mean, the 5-year plan demanded it.
Right. Well, and so it's such an interesting thing to me that, the USSR was so formidable during World War II because of its massive size and its massive manpower. We were talking about at the beginning of this how their army could have swept the rest of Europe off its feet. Like it was at the time the most formidable and dangerous ground army in the world. The dangerous backside of that is now, after Stalin, after this massacre, after all the gulags and like just the death, and especially during World War II, just the loss of life, Russia's still recovering from these casualties. Like so many people died that it significantly affected their society into the 21st century. Their population is still below, I believe, 200 million people.
Try 150.
Is it 150?
Less than that, I believe.
Okay, but again, that just gives you an idea of like the scope and the size of loss. And I think that's just it's so pertinent to remember that, like, you hear 50,000 people died here, 5 million people in Ukraine starved, but that's 5 million people like us, like our parents, like our siblings, like our friends. This affected an entire country, and nobody was spared. I mean, like, young to old, what were you gonna do? And so that wasn't long ago. Is just my thing. I just keep coming back to, the civil rights movement was less than 70 years ago.
It was Stalin himself who said 1 death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic.
That is an incredible quote for all the wrong reasons. And yes, I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is a direct quote right there. So, Will, would you consider the Great Leap Forward a genocide?
No, it's a tragedy, but it's not a genocide, because there were no ethnic group was a target of violence or destruction. It just, we're going to do this, and if they die, oh well, it's for the greater good, so forth. But the victims of the Great Leap Forward were not victims of a genocide. They were just victims of authoritarianism. So
one thing I wanna put forth and have you guys kind of discuss is, when you're talking about nuclear weapons, and I'm just going to kind of spring forward to like modern day situations, or let's just even use just Cold War. During the Cold War, we like to think that, like, if a nuclear war broke out, we'd either proactively bomb someone or we'd bomb them in response. And, in my head, like, what I think would happen is, like, if at the height of the Cold War, the USSR launched a nuke and it hit West Germany, the US would respond and like nuke a city back. But the doctrine, like the military plan, if that happened, was total war instantly. And we would have nuked Moscow over 30 times in the first day of a nuclear war with the USSR. And so it's
a nuclear war or an atomic war, like
atomic war. So during the Cold War, what the bombing doctrine was for Russia, for the USSR, that was the US's plan, was we were going to hit Moscow 30 or 40 times within the first day with atomic weapons. And that's not to say that other cities were spared, but it's such a mind-blowing thing to think about. Okay, think about the destruction that what we dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima received. Give 20 years of improvement and then do it 40 times on one city. It was just such an interesting thing to contrast, like, this idea of like retaliation or a city for a city, rather than just decimation of not just a city, but of like a people. Like, I can't imagine many people would survive 40 atomic bombs in a day.
I don't know anybody who could survive 40 atomic bombs.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you're walking away from that one.
But like, even if you were theoretically in a shelter where, like, it could withstand, let's just say 10. Could humanity make something that could withstand 40 atomic bombs?
I'm sure it's possible.
What's that military base in Montana? Is it NORAD?
NORAD? That's in
Yeah.
Colorado.
It's in Colorado. What can that withstand? I mean, the entire thing is built underground on giant shock absorbers.
Yeah, I would argue that regardless of how many, unless you're literally throwing enough weapons at it to simply like chip away the surface and just eventually dig the base out, you know. And even still, if you expose the base, if you uproot the bedrock and the dirt and everything, and the base is exposed because there's a massive crater, to what extent can it withstand a direct blast?
All right, so the Cheyenne Mountain Complex was dug under 600 meters of granite in the Cheyenne Mountains in Colorado, and it's designed to withstand a 25 megaton warhead.
So basically anything but Tsar Bomba.
Right.
That's nuts.
Absolutely insane. But even if the structure itself survived, would the human beings underneath survive the earthquake?
Yes.
Would the sonic pressure just crush our organs? Like, we don't know. We have no idea. Like, people don't understand. Like, the wind can literally peel your skin off from an atomic blast. Like,
I think if you're in the bunker, you might be okay. I mean, I don't know, Will. What do you think?
I think you'd be fine. The damn thing was built to withstand a direct nuclear bomb. So, I mean, our weapons technology is so out of league with everything else that we have under our belt, and that there isn't anything in the farthest reaches of science fiction that could withstand being hit with every single nuclear weapon that we have on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not Captain America's shield.
Well,
Yeah.
Captain America's shield will be fine, but Captain America will die.
Right. He is definitely not going to be all right.
He curls up in a little ball behind it, and he's fine. Just pokes his head out. Amazing. Yeah,
How soon before we're talking about something that makes nuclear weapons obsolete?
How soon before we're talking about something that makes them obsolete?
Yeah.
Are you talking about in terms of more destruction, or in terms of something that makes them obsolete because it's a defense system?
In terms of more destruction.
That's a great question. Unless I would say the only thing that springs to mind, because if we're talking about hypersonic weapons, obviously you still attach a nuclear warhead to that. It's just all about the delivery time, the speed that it approaches your target with, the accuracy and the detectability. That's not necessarily going to make a larger blast or anything. It just means that your missile is not going to be intercepted. In terms of something that's going to cause more destruction, I don't think we'll see that until we start fielding orbital weapon systems.
Yeah.
The second that we can either field nuclear weapons in space, or it's a directed energy, or just something that utilizes mass and force, I don't think we'll see anything top nuclear weapons until that.
I would agree with Justin.
I'm gonna throw out an interesting answer. Have you guys read the novel Ender's Game?
I've seen the movie.
I haven't actually read or seen it.
Okay, so I have not seen the movie, so I don't know what happens in the movie. I read the novel, and the novel is phenomenal. But the novel is about Ender controlling these militaries through simulations in these battles against this alien hive. And what we've come to find out and realize, and what he realizes after he completes his mission, is that he's actually from remotely controlling these battles. And this alien race lives so far away from humanity that they have to basically freeze and put their people in a time warp. And so, as he gets progressively further in this campaign, his technology, his fleet, his people, they get older and less effective. But what they were still finding is that even with their older model weapons, even with their older model ships, he was able to use relatively modern nuclear weapons to such great effect that it didn't matter. It's one of these things where even if something significantly more powerful than a nuclear bomb is somehow created, which I believe I agree with Justin, where unless you're talking about accelerating asteroids in outer space towards a target, I can't really see a way that I'm not a physicist or anything like that, so maybe I'm just talking up my booty. But unless you're talking about chucking rocks at planets from outer space, I can't really see it topping it. But it doesn't really matter. Like, if you drop a Tsar Bomba, I don't think it's any different than getting hit from an asteroid from outer space. Like, I think the decimation and the destruction and the damage it would cause, you could argue it would kill slightly more people, but like the end all outcome would be the same, which is just total destruction of an area.
What's your take, Will? Oh, sorry, Ben.
No, you're good. No.
I think Ben does make a good point, and we can draw contrast to atomic weapons versus nuclear weapons. No matter which one you're using, you're still going to be trading cities for cities and armies for armies at that point. So we could also draw it back to what I said earlier about accomplishing military objectives. If your only goal is to just make a bigger boom, we could with a single bomb, we could theoretically blow up all of China. What good would that do? I mean, we need something to take for ourselves in victory. And if there's no loot and there's no spoils, then as you, Justin, said, it would just be a Pyrrhic victory. And would it have all been for naught?
So, I mean, it's an interesting topic. And I think when you're talking about trading cities for cities, the delivery system is very important. And I think that's why, like what Justin was saying with like hypersonic delivery systems, like, a nuclear missile is great unless it gets intercepted in open airspace and it's not able to achieve its target, and so I think that's going to play the biggest role moving forward is ways to combat, how do we stop enemy projectiles from hitting us and getting ours to them? And I am the least qualified individual on Earth to weigh in how that works. So I'm not even going to go there. Is there any other things on like nuclear weapons you guys wanted to touch on? And we kind of bounced around to genocide and the ethics of total war.
I think we have enough for our first episode.
I think we've covered a lot for our first episode.
Just your everyday light, airy topics. We did avoid gender studies. That's a win in my book. Yeah, I mean, if you guys are good to cut it there, I'm good to cut it there.
I'm good.
I'm good.
If there's any final thoughts, now's the time.
See you next time.
All right, boys. It was a pleasure. Check out Justin Woodcock at On Point Financial Management here in Richmond. Check out New Horizon Solar Solutions for all your solar needs. And then
nice plug right there.
And then if any museums in Chicago want to hire my boy Will, that'd be cool.
That would be cool.
We would love that.
All right. Yeah, we would love that. All right, boys. It was awesome to get to hang out with you. I'm gonna call it a night.
Yeah, thank you for the dialogue, gentlemen.
Of course, it's always a pleasure.
Pleasure.
See you guys later.
My line. I stole that line.
Yeah.